The first thing Sergeant Marcus Hale noticed when he hit the atmosphere was that the planet's gravity was wrong. Not dangerously wrong, not kill you on impact wrong, just wrong enough that his capsule spun differently than the simulator said it would, and the parachute sequencing fired 3 seconds early, and he came down hard into a ridge of orange-red stone that crumbled under the impact pod like wet chalk. He lay there for 11 seconds with the dust settling around him and the smell of scorched polymer in his nose, and ran a body check the way they trained him. Fingers, toes, neck, vision, hearing. All present, all functional. A thin line of blood ran from his left eyebrow where the harness had bitten into his face on impact. He unclipped the harness, kicked the hatch, and stood up on an alien world. The sky was the color of old brass. 2 moons hung low on the horizon, one of them so large it seemed to be leaning on the mountains to the north. The ground was mostly rock, orange and rust-red, with patches of what might have been vegetation except that it was the gray-white of ash and grew perfectly still in the wind. Everything was still. No insects, no animal sound, just wind across stone and the soft tick of his pod cooling in the thin air. Marcus reached into the wreckage, pulled out the survival pack, and checked its contents by feel without looking away from the terrain. Rations for 4 days. Medical kit. Emergency beacon cracked, non-functional. Communication relay also cracked. 1 sidearm with 2 full magazines. A folding tool that doubled as a blade. His service knife. A thermal sheet. He put the broken beacon in his left thigh pocket anyway, out of habit. The habit being, you don't leave things behind unless you know they're useless. He didn't know yet. The mission briefing had been careful and wrong in the way that all mission briefings about new contact species were careful and wrong. Diplomatic escort. The Vreth Conclave had requested a single human representative to accompany their ruling delegation back to their home system for a treaty negotiation. Marcus had been selected because he was a sergeant, which made him high enough in rank to seem respectful, but low enough in rank to be expendable, and because he'd survived 2 previous first contact situations without firing a weapon or starting an interstellar incident. His commanding officer had shaken his hand and called him indispensable. He'd learned long ago that indispensable was the word officers used when they meant something else entirely. The dropship had taken fire 20 minutes out from the Vreth primary, not from an enemy, from the Vreth themselves. That was the part that hadn't been in the briefing. Now he was on a rock in the middle of what appeared to be a desert on a planet he didn't have a designation for, with 4 days of food and a gun he wasn't supposed to use. And somewhere above him, the political architecture of 2 civilizations was probably collapsing in real time. He found a shallow overhang in the cliff face 30 meters from the crash site and wedged himself into it, out of the wind. He drank a controlled amount of water, ate a quarter ration, and watched the sky until the light changed. The brass color deepened to something like amber, then to a dark violet he hadn't expected. The stars that appeared were dense and unfamiliar, clusters of them in shapes that his pattern-seeking brain wanted to name and couldn't. When he saw the first ship, it was low and slow, moving in the specific deliberate pattern of a vehicle conducting a systematic search rather than traveling anywhere. It wasn't human. The shape was wrong, too organic, ribs of visible superstructure along its ventral side like the exposed bones of something very large, its engine nacelles set wide and low rather than swept back. It moved with an unhurried certainty that bothered Marcus more than speed would have. Speed suggested urgency. This suggested confidence. They weren't afraid of finding him because they were certain of finding him eventually. The ship passed without stopping. He counted 7 more passes over the next 3 hours. They were looking for him, or looking for proof that he was dead, which amounted to the same thing in terms of what he needed to do about it. He thought carefully about what this meant. The Vreth had shot down the dropship. They were now searching for him. This could mean they wanted to capture him. It could mean they wanted to confirm his death. Or it could mean something more complicated, factional politics, a faction within the Vreth that had attacked against official orders, and another faction now trying to recover him before the situation became unrecoverable. The third option was the most optimistic. Marcus had learned not to lead with optimism in the field, but he'd also learned that abandoning optimism entirely was how soldiers stopped making decisions and started just reacting. He needed more information. When darkness came, proper darkness, cold and fast, with a spill of unfamiliar stars above, he moved north, toward the mountains, keeping to the rocks and away from anything that looked like a trail or path. He moved slowly and without sound. The suit kept him warm enough to function. He navigated by the big moon, which tracked in a clean arc, and by a ridge of darker rock he'd identified at last light as his northern marker. 3 hours of walking brought him to the edge of something that had been, at some point, a settlement. It was ruined now, but carefully ruined, not bombed or burned, but systematically dismantled. Structures that looked like they'd once been several stories tall had been reduced to their foundations, the material removed and taken away. The grid pattern of the streets remained, pressed into the stone, and in the corners of some foundations Marcus found the personal debris that always survived when people left in a hurry. A curved vessel that might have been a cup, small tiles engraved with a repeating pattern he didn't recognize, what appeared to be a child's toy, a carved figure, four-limbed, sitting with its knees drawn up and its head bowed, the posture so universal across species that it stopped him for a full 3 seconds before he moved on. Someone had lived here. Someone had left or been made to leave. The place wasn't old enough to be archaeological. Maybe 10 years, maybe 20. The edges of the dismantled foundations were too clean, the debris too specific and too sparse, the kind of debris that remains when people pack most of what they have and carry it with them, not the kind that remains when catastrophe strips a place. He found the door in the floor of what had been a larger building near the settlement center. It was flush with the stone, sealed with a bar lock that was Vreth manufacture but old, pre-current standard by at least a generation. He worked at it with the folding tool for 4 minutes, then simply applied force. The bar had corroded into its housing from years of temperature cycling. He got it open. Stone stairs going down, air rising from below that was warmer and damper than the surface. The smell of people not unpleasant, just undeniable, the specific organic warmth of bodies and food and sleep concentrated in an enclosed space. He stood at the top of the stairs for 10 full seconds, making himself breathe evenly, thinking through what he knew. The settlement had been cleared, not bombed. Someone had been careful. Careful settlements often have things worth being careful about still hidden inside them. He went down. There were 43 of them. Not Vreth, something else, or rather several something elses, because the people in the underground space were not all one species. Marcus had been in enough first contact situations to know when he was looking at a holding population, the particular quality of stillness that people develop when they've been afraid for a very long time, the way they arrange themselves without thinking into clusters of familiar faces, the specific kind of attention they paid to him when he appeared in the doorway, not the surprise of his arrival, but the immediate calculation of what he represented. Threat, opportunity, unknown variable. They watched him with the eyes of people who had learned to process new information very fast. He held both hands away from his body, palms visible, the gesture he'd learned to lead with. Every species he'd ever encountered had some version of the open palm. It wasn't universal, but it was common enough that it usually bought you the seconds you needed to demonstrate you weren't going to do anything terrible before someone else did something territorial. The calculation in their eyes ran its course. Nobody moved for a long time. He counted 11 distinct physiological types from where he stood, though in the uncertain light some of those might have been the same type at different life stages. 2 were unmistakably Vreth, with the brachiated limbs and bony skull ridges. Several others were species he had no name for, a bipedal type that was broader through the shoulder than any human, with skin that caught the light differently at different angles. A taller, more slender type with 4 arms, 2 resting at their sides and 2 folded across their chest in what might have been a defensive posture or might have been how they rested. A cluster of smaller beings near the back who moved in close formation and appeared to breathe in a synchronized pattern. All of them watching him. Then one of them moved forward. She came from a cluster near the far wall, and the rest of the group made space for her to pass through in a way that suggested she was known to them, or trusted by them, even if she wasn't one of them. She was Vreth, unmistakably Vreth, the same brachiated limbs, the same narrow thorax, the same ridge of bony protrusions down the back of the skull that the briefings had described as the species' defining characteristic, but smaller than any Vreth in the briefing materials, and moving with a quietness that wasn't timidity. It was something else. It was the quietness of someone who has learned to communicate everything without their voice. She stopped 2 meters from him and looked at his face with an expression he could not read but could not look away from. She didn't speak. He waited. She still didn't speak. He tried the 3 Vreth words he'd memorized from the briefing, the standard greeting, the phrase meaning non-hostile, and the phrase meaning I need assistance. He pronounced them badly. He knew the Vreth phonemic range used fricatives that human mouths could approximate but not replicate exactly, but he got close enough that several people in the room reacted. The ones who didn't speak Vreth leaned toward the ones who did, watching their faces for cues, the same behavior he'd observed in displaced communities everywhere he'd been. Learning through proximity, through the face of someone you trust reacting to something you don't understand. The girl, the young Vreth woman, watched him say the words. Then she touched her own throat. Just once, a flat-palmed gesture, almost dismissive, as if explaining something mundane. She couldn't speak. Not couldn't as in chose not to. Couldn't as in the capacity had been removed. He looked at her throat more carefully. Even in the poor light he could see the scar, old enough to have fully healed, new enough not to have faded into the surrounding tissue. Not an injury, not an accident. The placement and precision of it were surgical. He said the word for I understand from the briefing, which he was less sure of, and pointed to himself. Marcus. Then he pointed to her, raising his eyebrows in question. She looked at him for a long moment, that clear, unreachable expression, and then she reached into a fold of her garment and withdrew a small tile. The same engraved tiles he'd found in the ruins above, but this one was worn along the edges in the specific way of a thing carried and handled many times. She held it so he could see the symbol on it. A stylized figure with its head slightly bowed and both hands raised in the gesture he would come to know later. A name or a designation or both. He repeated the sound the symbol suggested to him, a soft sibilant followed by a long vowel, and what he guessed was a click, aware he was almost certainly wrong. She didn't correct him. She couldn't. But something in her expression changed in a way he recognized as the shift that happens when someone decides you are worth the effort of being understood. She turned and went back toward the group, and 2 of the other people, a species he didn't have a name for, 6-limbed and dark-complected in a way that might have been natural pigmentation, or might have been the adaptation of a species that lived underground or in low light, brought him something to drink. Water. Close enough to water that it served the same purpose, and tasted of something mineral and faint. He sat down on the stone floor and began the long work of learning to communicate with people he shared no language with. It took 4 days. Later, when he thought about those 4 days, Marcus would find it difficult to explain them to anyone who hadn't been there, because the difficulty wasn't loneliness or fear, though both were present in their specific textures. The difficulty was the weight of not knowing who had shot down the ship, not knowing why these people were underground, not knowing what the Vreth who were searching the surface wanted, or whether they were the Vreth he'd been sent to negotiate with, or some other faction, or whether the distinction mattered as much as he needed it to. What he did in those 4 days was learn. He'd learned languages before under pressure, enough to know that the key was to stop treating it as language acquisition and start treating it as relationship building. You didn't learn words in isolation. You learned the people who used them, the situations in which they used them, the specific quality of attention that preceded one word rather than another. You started with what was present, what was visible, what was safe to point at and name together. Food, water, sleep, cold, warm. Then you worked toward the things that required trust to name, danger, history, what happened before, what might happen after. The girl, he came to think of her as Saya, the closest he could render the name symbol on her tile, was there for all of it. She couldn't contribute language, but she contributed everything else. She corrected his pronunciations with gestures and expressions, a slight narrowing of the eyes for close but wrong, a tiny motion of her head for closer, an almost imperceptible stillness for correct. She drew shapes in the dust when words failed, maps, diagrams, sequences of events indicated by left-to-right ordering in the way you'd use a timeline. She connected him to the others, moving between the cluster groups with the ease of someone who had spent a long time being the bridge between people who couldn't speak to each other directly. The six-limbed people had a partial Vreth vocabulary, and some of the broader-shouldered beings had a partial version of something else, and Saya knew all of it, had built the community's internal communication infrastructure through 3 years of patient intermediation. He asked eventually about the settlement above. He asked through a relay. He spoke to the six-limbed person he'd come to think of as Tarak, who had the broadest cross-species vocabulary of anyone in the group, in the partial shared vocabulary they'd developed. Tarak relayed it in the community pidgin. Saya heard the question and began to answer. The answer took a long time to piece together, and he wasn't certain of all of it, but the shape of it was this. The settlement had been home to all of them, or most of them. Not a mixed-species commune by choice, exactly, but by circumstance. A border region where Vreth territorial claims overlapped with 3 other species' traditional territories, and where a generation of pragmatic coexistence had produced something that wasn't exactly community but functioned like one. Then the Vreth conclave had changed leadership. The new authority, a title that translated roughly as supreme voice, the head of the conclave, had reclassified the border territories and the mixed communities within them. The dismantling and displacement had been presented as administrative reorganization. The form it took was systematic, careful, and left no obvious evidence of anything other than bureaucratic process. The underground settlement had begun as a hiding place and had become a home, in the way that hiding places always do when people have nowhere else to go and enough time to understand they might be there for a while. He asked about the supreme voice. What came back was fragmentary and frightening in the particular way of things that are frightening not because they're unexpected, but because they confirm something you'd half suspected and hadn't wanted to be right about. A Vreth male of extreme age, the life expectancy of Vreth ran long, 200 standard years or more, and the supreme voice was old even by that measure. A leader who had held power for so long that the memory of anything before his rule had passed from lived experience into collective history, the kind of history that becomes mythology and is therefore immune to revision. A king, an absolute one. And Saya was his daughter. That part came out in fragments too, over the course of the 2nd and 3rd day. Her presence here among these displaced people was not coincidence. Her silence was not natural. She had been the Supreme Voice's youngest daughter, and at some point, the details didn't translate cleanly through the relay they'd built, but the emotion behind them was completely legible. She had objected to something, witnessed something, refused something, possibly all 3 in sequence. The king, her father, had dealt with the problem by removing her capacity to speak about it. Then he had dealt with her by giving her away. Marcus sat with this information for a long time. He sat with it and turned it over and looked at all its sides. He'd known rulers who operated this way, not alien rulers, human ones. The calculus was exactly the same across species, apparently. A problem you couldn't execute for political reasons became a gift you gave to someone else. Give a troublesome daughter to a displaced and dying community in a ruin on a border world, and if she dies in the chaos of it, you required no direct action. If she survives, well, she's mute and far away and has no authority and no allies and no voice. What can she tell anyone? 3 years of answering that question. 3 years of accumulating the answer in a language made of hands and eyes and 2 fingers in dust. 3 years of people around her understanding, without being told, that she was worth protecting. He asked the night of the 3rd day, through Tarak, whether the people here knew what she was trying to tell them. Tarak was quiet for a moment. Then he conveyed something that Marcus translated as, "We know it matters. We don't know what it is." He said, "Then we need to figure out what it is." It took another day and change. The system they built was laborious. Saya would shape something with her hands or draw it in the dust. Tarak would interpret the gesture in their shared pidgin. Marcus would ask questions that Tarak would translate back through the relay, and Saya would respond again. When they hit a wall, a concept that didn't have a gesture equivalent, an event too complex to mime, they slowed down and subdivided it. They went piece by piece. They checked each piece before adding the next one. What she was trying to tell them was this. The Vreth Conclave's negotiations with humanity were not a treaty process. They were a procurement process. The Supreme Voice needed something that Vreth biology could not produce on its own, a regenerative compound that existed in human neural tissue, specifically in the brain stem and surrounding structures. The compound had been identified in Vreth science approximately 40 years ago. Consumed in small quantities, it extended Vreth life. In larger quantities, it did something more significant. The Vreth term Saya used for what it did to the Supreme Voice specifically translated, as best Marcus could manage, as continuation beyond natural limit. He was not sure whether this meant immortality or something adjacent to it. The old king was not trying to negotiate with humanity. He was trying to get enough human representatives in one place, on Vreth territory, under Vreth authority, to harvest what he needed without triggering a response significant enough to threaten the Conclave's other diplomatic relationships. The treaty was a trap. The delegation that Earth had sent, the delegation that Marcus had been attached to as escort, was going to arrive at the Vreth primary world, and the welcome they received was not going to be diplomatic. Saya had been 14 years old, by Vreth reckoning, when she'd accessed a communication she wasn't supposed to see. A conversation between her father and 2 senior officials, documented on tile in the formal notation style of the Vreth Conclave, discussing timelines and quantities, and the cover story they would use afterward. She'd told someone she trusted, a senior member of her father's court she'd known since childhood. The someone had told someone else, probably not maliciously, probably because they didn't know what to do with what they'd been told and needed to share the weight of it. Within a month, Saya had lost her voice. Within 3 months, she had been removed from the royal court. Within a year, she had been given to the displaced communities on the border world, and the expectation had been, though no one said it directly, that this was an ending rather than an exile. She was 17 now. 3 years of dust floors and underground water and people who had lost everything protecting her because she was the only one who had ever stood close enough to the center of power to understand what was actually happening and had paid the price of saying so. They didn't know exactly what she knew, but they knew what it had cost her to know it. That was enough for them. Marcus listened to Tarak relay all of this. He watched Saya's face during the long pauses when Tarak searched for words. She watched him back. Her expression was the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and is now watching you carefully to see whether you understand what you're being asked to take on. He said, "Is there proof? Physical documentation?" She reached into her garment. She produced a tile, larger than the one with her name on it, thick, dense with Vreth engraving on both sides. The formal notation style he didn't know how to read, but recognized from the briefing materials as the high-register documentation format used for official conclave records. She held it out to him. He took it carefully with both hands. He couldn't read it, but it was physical. It was real. It was a thing she had been carrying for 3 years and was now handing to someone else, and the weight of the gesture was not lost on him. "Okay," he said to her, to the room, to the situation he was now in. "Then we have to move." The problem with moving was that the surface was still being searched. Marcus spent an afternoon on reconnaissance, going up through the floor door alone, climbing high enough in the rock face north of the ruins to get a clear sightline to the south and east. He counted 3 ships on a given pass, their patterns overlapping at specific intervals that told him something about their communication protocols. The search had contracted since the first day. They were concentrating on the zone around his crash site, working probability radius, which meant they hadn't found a trail or a heat signature or any sign of direction. That was useful. A contracting search meant they were less certain, not more. He had time, not a lot of time, some. He went back down and looked at what they had. They had material. The underground space was not just a shelter, it was a cache. 3 years of careful accumulation, Vreth technology salvaged from the dismantled settlement above, including components Marcus didn't have names for but could identify by function. Food stores organized with a precision that told him someone in the group understood scarcity mathematics. Tools. And in a section of the space separated from the rest by a rough partition made of stacked stone, something Tarak had built. A communications relay, crude by any standard, assembled from salvaged components using methods that were technically brilliant and legally complicated in ways Marcus chose not to think about. The relay wasn't strong enough to reach the human diplomatic vessel in orbit around the Vreth primary 2 systems over. But Marcus knew human communication protocols well enough to know what the relay would need to become strong enough. He knew because he'd spent 2 years on a listening station before his first contact deployment, monitoring relay signals from half a dozen species, learning the architecture of interstellar communication the way you learn any architecture, by understanding what fails and why. The crash pod had a communication array. The array wasn't functional as a standalone unit. The housing had been damaged in the impact, and 2 of the 3 primary conduits had sheared. But the core broadcasting elements were intact, and he was almost certain that combined with what Tarak had built, they could reach any human vessel within 3 systems with enough signal strength and encoding to avoid Vreth intercept algorithms. 48 hours on the surface, near the crash site, with ships running search patterns overhead. He laid it out for Tarak, who relayed it to the room. He watched the room's reaction while he spoke. The shape of objection was legible even without language. Too dangerous, too visible. The risk wasn't worth it. He understood the objections and didn't dismiss them. These people had survived 3 years on exactly the kind of caution that said don't expose yourself, don't take unnecessary risk, don't trust that any given gamble will pay off. That caution had kept 43 people alive. He answered as honestly as he could. This would be dangerous, yes. There was a real probability of failure, but the alternative was remaining underground while a delegation of his people walked into something from which none of them would return, and that was not something he was able to accept while he was still breathing and functional. He looked at Saya while he said the last part. She met his eyes. She made a gesture he'd come to recognize over the previous 4 days as something between agreement and resolve, a specific position of both hands held level with her sternum, fingers slightly spread, palms facing toward her. An old Vreth gesture. She'd shown it to him on the 2nd day when he'd been trying to understand the inscriptions on the documentation tile, and he'd asked what the symbol in the corner meant. Both hands level, weight accepted. I will carry what this means. He spent that night lying on his back in a corner of the underground space, running his hands over the components of Tarak's relay in the dark, mapping each one by touch, building the mental model he'd need to work by whatever light was available at the crash site. At some point before dawn, Tarak came and sat nearby and handed him something that turned out to be a tool, not human manufacture, not anything Marcus could identify the origin of, but the correct shape and size for the specific task he'd been thinking about. He looked at Tarak. Tarak made a gesture that conveyed, as close as Marcus could translate it, that they'd had it for a while and hadn't known what it was for until now. He went up at first light. The work at the crash site took 31 hours. He slept twice in short segments, pressed against the underside of the overturned capsule in a posture that was not comfortable but was hidden from above. He ate his remaining rations in small, measured increments, spacing them across the hours to maintain blood sugar without running through what he had. He worked with the precision he'd developed over 2 deployments and 4 contact situations, the particular economy of motion that comes from understanding you don't have enough of anything to waste any of it. No wasted movement. No second-guessing a connection once it was checked. No looking over your shoulder more than once every 30 minutes, because twice is paranoia and once is insufficient. 3 times, ships passed close enough to force him flat against the stone, held in place by stillness and the reflective coating on the back of his suit that Tarak had applied before he left, using something that smelled like industrial solvent and dried to the exact matte rust red of the surrounding rock. The 3rd time, a ship hovered for 7 minutes directly above the crash site at approximately 50 meters altitude. Marcus lay on his stomach under the capsule's tilted heat shield and breathed through his nose and felt his heartbeat in his palms and stared at the underside of the shield and thought, with the specific clarity that comes at moments of genuine threat when the cognitive bandwidth devoted to fear gets redirected towards something more useful, about the 43 people underground and the engraved tile in his chest pocket, and the look on Saya's face when she'd watched him climb the stairs. The ship moved on. He had a theory about why they kept missing him. The crash site was the obvious place to look, and they were looking at it, but they were looking at it from altitude with instruments calibrated for a human physiological signature in normal gear. The suit modification and the rock coloring changed his thermal profile enough to look like background noise at 50 meters. Or maybe the instruments weren't as sensitive as he was giving them credit for. Or maybe someone in the search pattern was deliberately not finding him, which was the most optimistic theory and the one he trusted least. He finished the relay assembly at hour 31, verified each connection twice, then powered it up. The signal he composed was brief and specific. He used the standard human emergency authentication sequence, which would register as a legitimate military distress signal on any human vessel, regardless of range. Then he layered the content over it in a cipher from his 2nd deployment, a redundant encoding method designed for exactly this kind of situation. Signal in hostile space, assume intercept, make the content accessible only to the intended receiver. The content was diplomatic hostility confirmed, biological acquisition threat against delegation, witness evidence secured, treaty negotiation must be aborted before arrival at Vreth Primary, require extraction for 44 personnel at attached coordinates. He sent it. Then he dismantled the relay into its smallest components and carried them back down underground. The response came 14 hours later. It came through the receiving element of Tarak's relay, a faint pulse that Tarak had to decode with 4 separate intermediate steps before Marcus could read it. Signal received and authenticated. Advise current status. Assistance inbound. Marcus sat with that for a long moment. 4 words: signal received, assistance inbound, doing the work of 4 days. He thought about the lieutenant somewhere 3 light months away who had been on watch duty at the right moment, and had done the right thing with what arrived on their screen. the small courage of the person in the middle of the chain who passes something on when the easy choice is to wait for someone else to take responsibility. He composed a location response and sent it, and went to find Saya to tell her. He found her where she often was, in the partition that housed Tarak's equipment, sitting with her back against the stone wall, one of the small engraved tiles in her hands, turning it over slowly in the way of someone thinking with their hands rather than their head. She looked up when he came in. He gave her the gesture he'd been using for good news. He'd invented it in the second day, and she'd adopted it, which had been unexpectedly reassuring. And then he sat across from her and explained what was coming as clearly as he could through the relay of expression and gesture and the limited shared vocabulary they'd built. She was still for a long time when he finished. He watched her process it. Then she stood up. She went out of the partition and into the main space and made a specific sound, not a vocalization, a percussive signal. The heel of her hand struck 3 times against the stone wall in a pattern he'd observed before as an all-attention call. The community reorganized itself, cluster by cluster, into an arrangement that centered on her. Even the species that didn't share vocabulary with her were watching, reading her body language with the attention of long practice. She told them, in the language of the community she'd built underground for 3 years, that it was time. The extraction came 36 hours later, which was longer than Marcus had hoped and shorter than he'd feared. 2 ships, human-spec courier vessels, small and fast, the kind used for covert diplomatic transit rather than military operations, that came in below active scanner altitude at night and put down in the ruins 200 meters from the floor door. The pilot of the first ship was a woman about Marcus's age with diplomatic corps insignia and the eyes of someone who had not slept in 30 hours and had spent most of that time in briefings that contained information she hadn't expected. She came down the ramp, looked at Marcus, and shook his hand with the grip of someone who was relieved and didn't want to show it. "Sergeant Hale," she said. "Ma'am," he said. "The delegation is 8 hours from orbit at the Vreth primary." "I know," he said. "What do we have?" "Physical documentation from inside the Vreth conclave's internal records, chain of custody confirmed by the witness who removed it from the primary site 3 years ago. Secondary documentation available at the home world location, which the witness can identify and lead a retrieval team to. The witness is the Supreme Voice's youngest daughter, which means her testimony comes with both credibility and a corroboration problem. And we have about 40 other people who are going to need documentation, relocation assistance, and protected status under whatever framework comes out of this." The pilot was looking past him at the people coming up from the floor door in the dark, the 6-limbed and the broad-shouldered and the cluster-breathing smaller beings, and the 2 Vreth who had chosen 3 years underground over whatever alternatives their society offered, and Saya, who had come up last and was standing in the cold night air with her head slightly tilted back and her eyes on the sky. "The witness," the pilot said. "Yes," he said. "She's the one who can't speak. She's the one who built a working interspecies communication system out of nothing in a basement," he said. "She happens to be unable to speak. Those are related facts, but the second one doesn't define the first." The pilot was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Get everyone aboard. There are things that happen at the edges of interstellar diplomacy that never appear in the formal record, because the formal record is the story that surviving institutions tell about themselves, and surviving institutions tend to edit toward coherence and away from complication. What happened in the 72 hours following extraction is recorded in the formal history as a successful intervention in an evolving first contact situation that threatened the integrity of the diplomatic process. The Vreth Conclave's Supreme Voice was confronted with physical evidence of a conspiracy against the diplomatic mission. A Vreth internal tribunal was convened under Article 9 of the Conclave's foundational governance protocols, the provision for judicial review of executive authority that predated the Supreme Voice's rule by 4 generations, and that no one had successfully invoked in living memory. Saya sat in front of that tribunal. She sat in front of it with 3 translators, a Vreth cultural specialist, and the full documentation, the tile she'd carried for 3 years, and the secondary records she led the retrieval team to on the home world, records that turned out to be far more extensive than even she had known, because the Supreme Voice had been careful, and careful people leave careful records. She sat in the chamber and she communicated, in the language she'd built underground, everything she had accumulated and protected and waited for 3 years to say. The tribunal took 48 hours. The finding took another 12. The Supreme Voice, confronted with the weight of what his youngest daughter had been carrying since she was 14 years old, lost the confidence of the senior Vreth officials who had sustained his authority. The mechanism of his removal was procedural and dry and irresistible. The treaty negotiation that followed was a real one. Marcus was present for very little of this in any official capacity. He had given his testimony, submitted his documentation, and been informed politely but clearly that the rest of this was diplomatic core work, and he was a sergeant and sergeants were indispensable, and this was the other thing indispensable meant. What he was present for was the waiting room. He was present for the hours in the diplomatic vessel's common area where Saya worked with the translators, building case by case through everything she knew, and he sat across the room and watched and wasn't needed for any of it, which was the correct outcome, and which he understood rationally and which was still, in the specific human way of things understood rationally, difficult. He was present for the moment on the second night when the work paused and everyone stepped away to eat, and Saya came across the room and sat near him, not next to him, near him, a specific proxemic distance he'd learned over 4 days underground to understand as the Vreth equivalent of companionship without demand, and looked out the viewport at the stars. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say, and silence, he'd learned, was her native medium. After a while she made the gesture, both hands level, weight accepted, and then she modified it slightly. She tipped her hands outward, away from her own chest, opening the gesture in his direction. He didn't have a translation for the modification. He understood it anyway. He'd been the person she'd given the weight to, and the gesture was acknowledging that, and it was the kind of acknowledgement that didn't require words to be completely precise. He was present for the moment when the tribunal findings came through on the official frequency, and a Vreth junior official read the Supreme Voice's removal from authority in the flat, procedural tone of all official announcements in all species formal registers, the tone that sounds like it's draining all the meaning from something but is actually the opposite, is the specific sound of something being made permanent and final. Saya didn't react in any large way. She went very still for a few seconds, and then she came back from wherever she went, and she looked at Marcus, and she pressed 2 fingers briefly to the scar on her throat and then lifted them away, like releasing something, like setting it down after carrying it for a very long time. He looked at her. She looked back. He thought that was probably the most eloquent thing he'd ever witnessed in any language, and he'd witnessed a lot of languages. The debrief took 6 hours to deliver and 3 days to document. Marcus answered every question honestly, including the questions about unauthorized relay assembly at an active crash site under aerial surveillance, about moving a non-combatant population of 43 through hostile territory without authorization, and about the decision to make direct contact with a displaced community before reporting his own survival status through official channels, which in hindsight he acknowledged was the protocol violation most likely to be flagged. When asked whether he'd considered the risk of his actions to the broader diplomatic situation, he said that he had considered it and determined that the risk of inaction was greater, since the alternative was remaining underground while a delegation of 17 people traveled to their deaths. Nobody formally argued with that assessment. The communications lieutenant who had received his signal, on watch duty alone in a monitoring station, who had made the decision to route the authenticated distress sequence up the chain before he'd fully parsed what was in it, received a commendation that Marcus argued for in writing and was satisfied to see approved. Tarak and the rest of the displaced community were relocated, with the cooperation of the new Vreth administration, to a territory that was legally theirs under the border protocols that the old Supreme Voice had unilaterally reclassified. The relocation took 8 months to complete and another year to stabilize, and in the second year Marcus received a tile in the mail with no accompanying documentation, a small one, engraved with the repeating pattern he recognized from the ruins, the one that appeared in the corners of foundations when people had left in a hurry. He put it on the shelf above his bunk. It was still there years later when he moved out of the barracks, and he took it with him. Saya's situation was more complicated, in the way that situations are always more complicated when the person at the center of them is technically a member of an institution that harmed them. She was Vreth Conclave citizenship by birth. She was royal family by parentage. Neither of those facts was straightforward now, and the legal processes for resolving them moved with the specific friction of systems designed primarily to preserve their own credibility. Marcus watched this from a distance and was frustrated by it in the way of someone who understands that bureaucratic process exists for real reasons and still finds it insufficient in specific cases. What the diplomatic corps medical team told him after their assessment was this: what had been done to her voice was structurally recent enough, and the damage specific enough that restoration was possible. Vreth's surgical capability for this kind of repair was sophisticated. The probability of success was, in the physician's exact words, favorable. What Marcus didn't know was whether she wanted it. He asked her on the 4th day after the tribunal findings. He asked through the best translator they had, a woman who had spent 8 years on Vreth cultural research, and who had, over the past week, learned to read Saya's non-verbal communication with an accuracy that Marcus thought was probably better than his own at this point. He asked because he'd been thinking about it since the medical report, and he couldn't figure out how to think about it without asking, and because asking was the only thing he could do that wasn't someone else deciding for her again. The translator relayed the question. Saya looked at Marcus while the words were being translated, watching his face rather than the translator's. She'd started doing that in the 3rd day, using him as a reference point, a readable face in uncertain situations. When the translation finished, she was still for a moment. Then she made the two-handed gesture, the familiar one, weight accepted. I will carry what this means. And then she made a gesture he hadn't seen before. Her right hand lifted slowly from her side to hold open in front of her, palm up, receiving. The translator hesitated. The second part is ambiguous, she said quietly to Marcus. Something about readiness or openness to receiving something. She's ready, Marcus said. The translator looked at him. That's an interpretation. Yes, he said. But it's the right one. There is a moment in the recovery room, not in the record, that Marcus Hale carries with him in the specific way of things that don't fit into any formal category, and so persist instead in the category of what you know when you stop explaining things to other people and just think. It's after the procedure. The medical team has stepped out for the preliminary assessment period. Saya is sitting upright in the bed, against every instruction, because she had never done well with enclosed horizontal spaces. He knew this from 4 days underground, where she had always slept sitting against a wall, and the staff had learned to stop arguing about it. He sits across from her, no translators, no protocol. Just the two of them in a room that smells of antiseptic and recycled air, with the faint sound of the vessel's systems humming in the walls. He is thinking, as he often does in quiet moments, about the desert planet, about the overturned capsule and the 31 hours in its shadow, about the dust floors and the engraved tiles and the carved figure sitting with its knees drawn up, about the quality of the dark underground and the way she moved through it without hesitation, absolutely certain of where things were, where people were, navigating by long familiarity the way people learn to navigate the things they've lived inside long enough. She opens her mouth. Nothing comes out. He waits. She tries again, with the expression of someone approaching something difficult in public for the first time. Not distress. The concentration of someone who has been planning this moment for a while and is now in it, and finding that the plan and the reality are different things. What comes out the third time is not a word. It's a sound. Unformed, just sound, just the raw material of speech before the architecture of language gives it meaning. But it's there. It's in the room, in the air between them, and she hears it herself, hears her own voice for the first time in 3 years, and something in her face changes in a way he doesn't have a word for and doesn't need one. She makes the receiving gesture, right hand, palm up, but she's not waiting for something from outside herself. She's receiving her own voice, acknowledging it, accepting the weight of it. He doesn't say anything. It doesn't seem like his moment to speak. She shapes her mouth around something, works at it, checks each component before adding the next, the same way he'd worked through the relay assembly in the dark. What comes out is his name. Badly pronounced, unmistakably his. He looks at her. She looks back, and her expression is very still. The way expressions go still when someone is holding something large and hasn't decided yet whether to believe it's real. He says her name the closest he can get to it in the same tentative tone she'd used for his. Bad pronunciation, unmistakably her. She makes a sound that might be the beginning of a laugh, just the beginning. Just the raw material of it. The medical team comes back in, and the assessment begins, and Marcus stands up and answers their questions about baseline responsiveness and general orientation, and Saya sits in the bed watching him interact with the medical team, with an expression he will think about later for a long time. The expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they have been trying to reach, and is still deciding whether to believe it. What people say about humans, what every species eventually says about humans, in every first contact record and xenoanthropology paper and after-action debrief that Marcus had ever encountered, is that humans don't seem to know when they're supposed to stop. It is never meant as a compliment. It is said with the specific frustration of someone who has modeled the behavior, run the probability on what a reasonable entity would do under those conditions, and watched the human fail to conform to the model. You should have stayed underground and waited for extraction. You should not have moved 43 noncombatants through active hostile terrain without authorization. You should have weighed the probability of your signal reaching a human vessel against the risk of exposure and made a different calculation. At some point in the sequence of events, a reasonable entity would have stopped. And you didn't, and here we are. Marcus had heard some version of this from commanders, analysts, xenobiologists, and the occasional alien administrator with enough shared vocabulary to say it directly. He'd never quite figured out how to respond, because the response that came naturally to him was, "I know, and I'd do it again." He thought about Saya sitting underground for 3 years, holding something she knew was important in the only way she could hold it. Not in words, not in official documentation, not in any channel that the people who had silenced her could access or suppress. Holding it in her hands and her face and 2 fingers in dust. Keeping it exact and intact and transmittable, because she understood that it mattered, and that keeping it was the only thing she could do with it, until the moment when there was something else she could do. He thought about a 14-year-old who had stood close enough to power to understand what it was actually doing, and had said so, and had paid the price that people pay for that in every system he'd ever encountered, and had not stopped being the person who would have said so. He thought about the receiving gesture, right hand, palm up, and the specific quality of her stillness in the recovery room, and the sound of his name, in a voice that had not been used for 3 years. He thought about the Vreth cultural specialist who had told him, when he'd asked about the two-handed gesture with fingers spread, that it was archaic, a phrase from the conclave's founding period, used in ratification ceremonies when a speaker formally took on the consequences of the words they were about to say. Not a casual gesture, a deliberate one. The weight is accepted. I know what this means and I am choosing to carry it. Humans had something like that. Probably had something like that in most of their languages, in various forms, in various ceremonies that had accumulated weight over generations. The part of a person that looks at the situation clearly, sees the risk, runs the numbers, understands the cost, and says yes anyway. Not ignorance, not failure to model the risk. Just the decision, made with full knowledge, that the weight is worth what it leads to. He never quite figured out how to explain this to the people who asked, so he stopped trying to after a while. He just did what he did. He carried what he carried. He showed up on desert planets and fixed communication relays in the shadow of crash sites while search ships crossed overhead, and he sat in the dark and learned to listen with his eyes, and when the moment came to move, he moved. And the 43 people underground who had protected something important for 3 years found themselves above ground, in the light. And the girl who had been given away because her father thought silence was the same as absence found her voice in a room that was finally quiet enough to hear it. And 2 diplomats signed a real treaty, not a trap. And somewhere in a monitoring station, 3 light months from the nearest colony, a junior lieutenant on watch duty did the right thing with the signal that arrived on his screen at 300 hours when he was the only one there to receive it. And the story went on. That is, perhaps, the most human thing about it. Not the victory, not the survival, not the clever relay assembly or the careful movement through hostile terrain or the testimony that brought down a ruler who had held power for 2 centuries without challenge. Just the fact that the story went on. That we kept going until it did.